Hey, amazing viewers! Before we go into this riveting narrative, drop your location in the comments below. We love connecting with you all around the world. Also, if this is your first time here, press the subscribe button and join our incredible journey. Let's hit 10,000 subscribers this month together. Your support means everything. The cry in the dark. Jack had always believed that fate had a way of leading him to places he needed to be. Some nights, it was the scene of a robbery. Other nights, a domestic dispute that needed calming. But nothing could have prepared him for what he found on that bitter November night, a discovery that would change his life forever. It was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones, making every breath feel like ice against your lungs. The streets of the small New England town were quiet, the streetlights casting long shadows as Jack drove through his usual patrol route. The town, nestled between rolling hills and thick forests, had always felt like home to him. Each house, each winding street held memories, some warm, some haunting. Jack was a seasoned officer, respected and reliable. He had spent over 2 decades in uniform, walking the thin line between justice and chaos. At 39, he had long come to terms with the solitude his career required. No wife, no children, just his duty and the memories of his father, a man who had worn the same badge before him and paid the ultimate price for it. As he pulled his cruiser into a small park near the outskirts of town, he exhaled deeply, letting the silence of the night settle around him. He had planned to sit for a while, maybe read a few pages of his favorite detective novel before his next round. But the moment his hand reached for the book, a sound cut through the stillness, so faint that at first, he thought he had imagined it. A cry. Jack frowned, sitting up straighter. It wasn't the usual late-night noises, no drunken laughter from the nearby bar, no rustling from stray animals scavenging through the trash bins. This was different. Small, desperate. He stepped out of the car, his breath visible in the cold air. The sound came again, weak but insistent. His pulse quickened as he followed the noise, his boots crunching against the frost-covered grass. His hand instinctively rested on his holster, muscles tense with the unknown. Then he saw it, a rusted metal trash bin, barely illuminated by the dim glow of a nearby street lamp. The lid was slightly ajar, something shifting inside. Jack's gut clenched. He had seen his fair share of crime, but something about this sent a different kind of dread clawing through his chest. Slowly, he reached out and lifted the lid. His breath caught in his throat. Inside, wrapped in a tattered blanket, was a newborn baby. Her tiny face scrunched up in distress, her mouth open in a silent wail, her fists clenched against the cold. She was so small, so fragile, her skin pale and trembling from the night air. For a moment, Jack couldn't move. It was as if time had stopped, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like an unseen force. Who could do something like this? The question barely formed in his mind before his instincts kicked in. Gently, he reached in, scooping the baby into his arms. She was ice cold, her little body shivering against him. Without thinking, he pulled off his jacket and wrapped her in it, his heart hammering in his chest. "You're safe now," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Holding her close, he grabbed his radio and called for an ambulance. His voice was steady, professional, but inside, he was unraveling. As he carried her to his patrol car, something inside him shifted. He had spent his life protecting people, upholding the law, facing danger head-on. But never had he felt a responsibility as profound as this. The baby let out a small sigh, her tiny hand resting against his chest, and for the first time in a long time, Jack felt something stir deep within him, a fierce, unshakable need to protect her. Who had left her here? Why? These questions burned in his mind, but one thing was clear: she was his responsibility now, and he would do whatever it took to make sure she never felt alone again. As the wail of sirens echoed through the night, Jack made a silent promise. He would find out who abandoned her, and he would never let her be forgotten. The bond that changed everything. Jack had been through many difficult cases in his career: busted drug rings, violent crime scenes, and missing persons reports that left scars on the soul. But nothing had ever unsettled him quite like this. The hospital's emergency ward was bathed in a harsh white glow, the sterility of it all making him feel out of place. He stood near the neonatal unit, watching through the glass as nurses worked tirelessly to care for the tiny infant he had found. She had been so small in his arms, barely more than a whisper against his chest, and yet she had filled a space inside him that he hadn't even realized was empty. Jack had never been an emotional man, but when the nurse finally came out and gave him a reassuring nod, "She's stable. A little underweight and dehydrated, but she'll be okay," something inside him loosened. Relief. "Did she have a name?" the nurse asked, her voice gentle. Jack hesitated. A name. He had barely allowed himself to think about it, but looking at her now, separated from him only by the hospital's glass barrier, he knew she deserved one. "Floor," he said at last, the name coming to him like a whisper from somewhere deep inside, like a little flower. The nurse smiled, jotting it down in her notes. "That's beautiful. Are you family?" The question caught him off guard. Was he? No, he answered automatically, but the word felt wrong the moment it left his lips. In the hours that followed, Jack couldn't bring himself to leave the hospital. He sat outside the neonatal ward, watching as the doctors monitored Fleur, occasionally checking in to see if she needed anything. He was just supposed to be an officer on duty, a man who had stumbled upon an abandoned baby in a park. He had done his job, and yet, every time he tried to walk away, something pulled him back. A few days later, Fleur was moved to the pediatric unit, where she would stay until a foster home could be found. Jack knew how the system worked. Too many children, not enough families, and cases like hers often got lost in the shuffle. That thought didn't sit well with him. One evening, after a long shift, Jack found himself driving past the hospital instead of heading home. He had no real reason to be there, but his car seemed to know the way on its own. Inside, Fleur was asleep in a tiny crib, her face peaceful, her little hands curled into fists. A soft pink blanket covered her now, a stark contrast to the dirty rags she had been wrapped in when he found her. He shouldn't have been there. He knew that. Yet when the nurse smiled and motioned for him to come closer, he didn't hesitate. "She likes you," the nurse observed as he reached down, gently brushing a finger against Fleur's tiny hand. Jack didn't respond. He didn't have the words for what he was feeling. That night, he made his decision. He wouldn't let her disappear into the system. He had spent years protecting people from the shadows, solving cases that often left him feeling like justice was a fleeting thing. But this was something he could change. He walked straight to the department's social services liaison the next morning. "I want to foster her," he said, his voice firm. The woman behind the desk raised an eyebrow, glancing up from her paperwork. "Officer Callahan," she started, folding her hands together. "That's a serious request. You live alone. Your job is dangerous. Do you really think you're the right person to take in an infant?" Jack met her gaze without hesitation. "I may not have a wife, a white picket fence, or a quiet office job," he admitted, "but I found her, and I'm not going to let her be just another case file in the system. She deserves someone who actually cares about where she ends up." The social worker studied him for a long moment before sighing. "Fostering isn't easy," she warned. "There are background checks, home visits, legal procedures, and even if you foster her, adoption is a whole other battle." Jack's jaw tightened. "I don't care how long it takes," he said. "I'll do whatever it takes." The first night. 2 weeks later, Jack's life changed forever. He stood in the middle of his small one-bedroom home, staring at the bassinet he had hastily assembled in his living room. He had spent the past few nights reading everything he could about babies, how to hold them, how to feed them, how to tell if they were crying because they were hungry or just tired. None of it had prepared him for the reality of actually bringing Fleur home. She was nestled in his arms, blinking up at him with sleepy eyes, and for the first time in his life, Jack Callahan felt something dangerously close to fear. He had faced armed criminals, chased down drug dealers, and broken up violent street fights. But the idea of being responsible for this tiny life, that scared him in a way nothing else ever had. "You're going to have to be patient with me, kid," he murmured, rocking her gently. "I have no idea what I'm doing." Fleur didn't seem to mind. She let out a tiny sigh and nuzzled closer to his chest, her warmth seeping into him. Jack sat down on the couch, holding her close, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. He knew there would be challenges ahead. Nights filled with sleepless crying, doctor's visits, learning how to juggle work and fatherhood. But as he looked down at the baby in his arms, he knew one thing for certain. He had spent years chasing justice. Now he had something even more important to protect. His daughter. A father's fight. Jack never thought his life would take this turn. His world had always been defined by duty. Long nights, dangerous chases, and the endless battle between right and wrong. He had faced criminals armed with knives and guns, but none of those encounters had ever made his hands tremble the way they did the first time he had to change Fleur's diaper. It had been an all-out war. The baby had wriggled and kicked, her tiny fists flailing as he tried to figure out how to fasten the tabs. The internet had made it seem so simple. Just peel, press, and done. But reality was far crueler. By the time he managed to secure the diaper, both of them were exhausted. He sat back on the floor, staring at Fleur as she gurgled up at him, victorious. "You win, kid," he muttered, rubbing a hand down his face. "This is harder than taking down a drug ring." Fleur cooed, her tiny fingers reaching for his badge. Jack let her grab onto it, his heart tightening. It had only been a few weeks, but he couldn't imagine life without her anymore. She had become his world. The system fights back. But just when he thought he had things figured out, the world reminded him that nothing worth fighting for ever came easy. It started with a phone call from social services. "We need to talk," the woman on the other end said, her tone clipped and professional. "There's been a family interested in adopting Fleur." Jack felt something tighten in his chest. "A family," he repeated, gripping the phone harder. "She already has a home." There was a long pause. "Officer Callahan, we appreciate what you've done," the social worker said carefully. "But fostering was always meant to be temporary. Fleur deserves a stable family, 2 parents, financial security, a home that can provide everything she needs." Jack's jaw clenched. "And you don't think I can provide that?" "Realistically," she said, not uncandidly, "you're a single man with a dangerous job. You work long hours. What happens if something happens to you? Who will take care of her then?" Jack had no answer for that. For years, he had lived as if his own life didn't matter much. He had always been willing to throw himself into danger because there was no one waiting for him at home. But now there was. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. That night, he sat in his small kitchen, staring at the paperwork scattered across the table. Fleur was asleep in the bassinet next to him, her tiny breaths filling the quiet. He reached over and ran a gentle finger across her forehead. "They think I can't do this," he murmured. "That I can't be what you need." Fleur stirred slightly but stayed asleep. Jack exhaled. "I won't lose you, kid," he whispered. "I promise." The battle for custody. Jack had never been one for courtroom battles. His fights were usually settled with handcuffs, not legal arguments. But when he was told that Fleur would be moved to a new home within the month, he knew he had no choice. He hired a lawyer. He gathered character references. He even took time off work to attend parenting classes, determined to prove that he was willing to do whatever it took. His colleagues, at first, had been shocked. "You? A dad?" His partner, Officer Mills, had scoffed. "I never even saw you date anyone. And now you're raising a kid." Jack only shrugged. "Guess life surprises you sometimes." It wasn't easy. The legal system wasn't built for single fathers. especially not ones with dangerous jobs. Every meeting with social services felt like another uphill battle. "Do you have a backup guardian in case of an emergency?" Jack hesitated. "No, but I'll find one." "Do you plan to reduce your hours at work?" Another hesitation. "If I have to." Each answer felt like another strike against him, but he refused to give up. The night before the final hearing, he sat in Floor's nursery, a space he had put together with his own hands, filled with second-hand furniture and soft pastel colors. He had never cared much about home decor before, but for her, he had done his best. He watched as she slept, her tiny hand curled into a fist, and he made one last promise. "Tomorrow, I fight for you." The verdict that changed everything. The courtroom was smaller than he expected. Floor wasn't there. She was with a temporary caregiver, safe and oblivious to the battle happening over her fate. Jack sat at the defendant's table, wearing his best suit, feeling more nervous than he ever had in his life. Across from him sat the couple that wanted to adopt Floor. They were wealthy, married, and smiling warmly. Jack hated them for it. The judge listened as the social worker laid out the case. "Officer Callahan has done an admirable job caring for Floor," she admitted. "But we must consider what is in the child's best interest long term." Jack's lawyer stood next. "Your Honor," she began, "Floor was abandoned. She was left to die in the cold. And this man, he didn't just save her. He loved her. He fought for her. How many children in the system can say they have someone willing to fight for them like this?" Jack swallowed hard. The judge remained silent for a long moment, flipping through the paperwork. Finally, she looked up. "Officer Callahan," she said, "do you understand what you're asking for? Adoption is permanent. This will change your life forever." Jack met her gaze without hesitation. "It already has," he said. The judge sighed, then nodded. "Then my ruling is final. Custody is granted to Officer Jack Callahan." For a moment, Jack couldn't breathe. He barely registered the words as his lawyer grinned, shaking his hand. The wealthy couple looked disappointed, but Jack didn't care. All he cared about was getting home, getting to his daughter. A new beginning. That night, Jack sat in Floor's room, holding her close as she giggled in his arms. She didn't understand what had happened, didn't know that she had almost been taken from him. But Jack did. He kissed the top of her head, breathing her in. "We did it, kid," he murmured. "We're officially a family." Floor cooed, her tiny fingers grasping his shirt. Jack smiled. For the first time in years, he felt whole. And he knew, without a doubt, that saving her had also saved him. The unbreakable bond. Jack never knew that love could sneak up on a person, change them from the inside out, and make them question everything they thought they knew about themselves. But that's exactly what happened when Floor entered his life. He had always been the type of man who kept his emotions in check, who never let himself get too attached. It was a survival mechanism, a way to protect himself from the kind of heartbreak he had seen his mother endure after his father died in the line of duty. But Floor had shattered all of that. From the moment he brought her home, she had become the center of his world. Every cry, every tiny giggle, every sleepy sigh she made in the middle of the night, it was like his heart had been rewired to beat for her. Being a father wasn't easy. Jack had always been prepared for the physical challenges of raising a baby. The sleepless nights, the endless feedings, the occasional bouts of crying that could make even the strongest man question his sanity. But what caught him off guard were the small, quiet moments that made everything worth it. The way Floor would reach out for him when she was scared. The way her tiny hand would curl around his finger, as if to say, "I trust you." The way she would fall asleep on his chest, her warmth sinking into him, making him feel like maybe, just maybe, he was doing something right. And so, despite the doubts of social workers, despite the fears that had clawed at the back of his mind, Jack knew he had made the right decision. Floor was his daughter. Nothing could change that now. Growing together. As the months passed, Jack fell into a rhythm. His mornings were no longer spent in the quiet solitude of his small home, but were instead filled with the sound of Floor's laughter and the scent of baby powder. His patrol car, once pristine and orderly, now had a stuffed bunny strapped into the passenger seat because Floor cried whenever he left it behind. His coworkers found it hilarious. "You've gone soft," Callahan, his partner, Mills, teased one afternoon as they sat in their patrol car, watching traffic. "You used to be the guy who ate cold sandwiches and chased criminals through alleyways. Now you're the guy who sings lullabies and shops for baby clothes." Jack only shrugged, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Yeah, well," he said, "life changes." Mills shook his head. "Never thought I'd see the day." Jack hadn't either, but he wouldn't trade it for anything. First steps, first words, first fears. Floor grew quickly. One day, she was a tiny bundle in his arms, barely able to keep her head up. The next, she was wobbling on unsteady legs, determined to chase after him every time he walked across the room. Her first word was "da." Jack had been sitting on the couch, exhausted from a double shift, when she looked up at him with her big brown eyes and said it. Just one syllable. Simple. Soft. But it hit him harder than anything ever had. "Da." Jack had spent most of his life thinking he would never have a family of his own. That he was too broken, too married to his job, too afraid of what love could take from him. But in that moment, with Floor looking up at him, he realized something. Love wasn't something to be feared. It was something to be fought for. A father's worst nightmare. Jack had always known that being a cop and a father would come with risks. He had done everything he could to keep Floor safe, to make sure she never saw the darker side of his world. But life had a way of testing people, of forcing them to confront their worst fears when they least expected it. It happened on a quiet Saturday afternoon. Jack and Floor had gone to the park, a simple father-daughter outing that had become their little tradition. He had been pushing her on the swings, listening to her giggle as she kicked her legs, when his phone buzzed. A call from the station. He hesitated. He had promised himself he wouldn't let work interfere with their time together. But old habits died hard. He stepped a few feet away, answering the call with his back turned for only a moment. That was all it took. When he turned back around, Floor was gone. His blood ran cold. His eyes scanned the playground, searching for her tiny figure. "Floor," he called, his voice sharp, urgent. Nothing. The world tilted, panic clawing at his chest as he sprinted toward the last place he had seen her. His heart pounded, a sickening dread settling in his stomach. And then, a scream. High-pitched, frantic. "Floor!" Jack ran faster than he ever had before, dodging past startled parents and wide-eyed children until he found her, just beyond the swings, near the edge of the park, struggling against a man who had grabbed her by the wrist. Without thinking, Jack drew his weapon. "Let her go," he barked, his voice like thunder. The man froze. For a split second, their eyes met, Jack's filled with fury, the stranger's filled with something else. Panic. And then, just like that, the man let go and ran. Jack wanted to chase him. Every instinct screamed at him to take off, to track the bastard down and make him pay. But then Floor was crying, reaching for him, and nothing else mattered. He dropped to his knees, pulling her into his arms. "Sheh, you're okay," he murmured, stroking her hair, his heart still hammering. "You're safe, baby girl. I've got you." She clung to him, her small body shaking. And Jack knew he would never forgive himself for this. The fallout. The next few days were a blur. The police launched an investigation, but the man who had tried to take Floor had disappeared. Jack blamed himself. He replayed the moment over and over, wondering what he could have done differently. "You didn't fail her," Mills told him one night over drinks. "You saved her." Jack shook his head. "I should have never let go of her hand." But no matter how much he blamed himself, one thing became clear. He had almost lost her, and he couldn't let that happen again. So he made a decision. Flor needed him to be more than just a father. She needed him to be present. The next morning, he walked into his captain's office and placed his badge on the desk. "I'm retiring," he said, his voice firm. His captain stared at him. "Callahan, you're one of the best detectives we have. You really want to walk away?" Jack glanced at the picture in his wallet, the one of Flor on her first birthday, cake smeared across her face. "Yeah," he said, "I do." Because for the first time in his life, he had something more important than the job. He had a daughter to protect, and he wasn't going to let anything take her away from him. Full circle, Jack had always thought his legacy would be tied to his badge. For most of his life, he believed he would leave this world the same way his father did, serving, protecting, and wearing the uniform until his last breath. But as he stood at the edge of the small stage, watching Flor adjust the microphone, he realized his legacy wasn't in the cases he solved, the criminals he put away, or the battles he fought in the streets. It was in her. The little girl he had found in the trash that night so many years ago. The one he had cradled in his arms, who had filled the emptiness inside him without ever knowing it. The child he had fought for, protected, and raised. Now she was standing before a packed auditorium, about to change lives just like she had changed his. Jack swallowed hard, emotion tightening in his chest. This wasn't just another event. This was her moment. A life rewritten. The years had passed faster than Jack could have ever imagined. One moment, he was rocking Flor to sleep in their tiny home, terrified of failing as a father. The next, she was graduating from high school with honors, standing in front of thousands as the keynote speaker for her class. She had grown into a remarkable woman, intelligent, compassionate, driven. And she had a story to tell. She had never forgotten where she came from, never ignored the pain of her past. Instead, she had turned it into purpose. When Flor turned 18, she made a choice that left Jack both proud and heartbroken. "I want to study social work," she had told him, her eyes burning with determination. "I want to help kids like me." Jack had nodded, even as his heart clenched, because she had been his whole world. And soon, she would be leaving it to build her own. A speech that changed everything. Flor adjusted the microphone, scanning the sea of faces before her. She looked calm, composed, but Jack knew better. He could see the slight tremor in her fingers, the way she took a deep breath before speaking. And then, in a voice filled with quiet strength, she began. "When I was born, someone decided my life didn't matter." The room fell silent. Jack felt his breath catch. "I was left in a trash bin on a cold November night, barely clinging to life. I don't remember it, of course, but I've lived with the knowledge my whole life." Jack clenched his fists. He had spent years trying to forget that image, the tiny, shivering bundle in his arms, the helplessness he had felt. But she had never run from it. She had embraced it. But that night, Flor continued, someone else made a different decision. A man who had no reason to care, no reason to get involved, chose to save me. She turned slightly, her eyes finding Jack's in the crowd. And that decision changed everything. Jack felt his throat tighten. The man who found me didn't just save my life. He gave me one. He fought for me when no one else would. He raised me, protected me, loved me, even when the world told him he wasn't the right person for the job. A soft murmur rippled through the audience. Flor smiled faintly, glancing down at the paper in her hands before looking back up. "People always ask me if I hate the person who abandoned me," she said. "If I ever wanted revenge. But the truth is, I don't think about them anymore, because I was never truly abandoned. I was found. I was chosen." Jack felt his eyes burn. Flor took another breath, her voice steady. "And that's why I stand here today, about to dedicate my life to making sure that no child ever has to feel unwanted. Because one man's love was enough to rewrite my entire story." She paused. And maybe, just maybe, It's enough to rewrite someone else's too. Full circle. Jack barely heard the thunderous applause. All he could see was her, standing tall, confident, a woman he could barely believe was once the fragile baby he had cradled against his chest. When she stepped off the stage, she walked straight toward him. "Dad," she whispered, her eyes glistening. And that single word shattered him. She wrapped her arms around him, and Jack held onto her like he never wanted to let go. "You were always enough," she murmured against his shoulder. "Always." Jack closed his eyes, breathing her in. He had spent his whole life searching for meaning, for something to make him feel whole. But he had found it years ago, in a trash bin, on a cold November night, a legacy of love. Years later, Jack sat on the front porch of his home, watching the sunset. His hands, once strong and steady, were now marked with age. His badge sat on the table beside him, a relic of the man he used to be. Fleur sat next to him, flipping through old photo albums, laughing at pictures of her childhood. And beside her was her son, Jack's grandson, a boy with bright eyes and an endless curiosity for the world. "Grandpa," the boy asked, tugging at Jack's sleeve, "is it true you used to be a hero?" Jack chuckled. "No, kid," he said, ruffling the boy's hair. "I was never a hero." Fleur smiled, glancing up. "No," she agreed. "You were something better." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah? And what's that?" Fleur reached over, squeezing his hand. "A father," she said simply. Jack smiled, his heart full in a way it had never been before. Because at the end of it all, he hadn't just saved a life that night. He had built one, and he wouldn't change a single second of it. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.